All right. A good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining us for the CSS Web Talk on global nuclear non-proliferation trends, stalled governance, rising risks. My name is Nivien Schepers. I am senior researcher at the Center for Security Studies and the head of the Swiss and Euro-Atlantic Security Team. So for those of you who are not aware, the Center for Security Studies at ETH Zurich is a center of competence for international and Swiss security policy that is engaged in academic research, education, and policy consultancy. And the CSS think tank covers a very broad array of topics from peace promotion and mediation to technologies, defense, and cybersecurity, as well as issues related to international order and governance. And it's the latter that is the context then for today's discussion. So, as always, a number of nuclear proliferation issues that are sort of simmering in the background, but I think over the last few years and particularly months even, it really does feel like more of them are approaching a boiling point. I think everyone has seen a rising number of commentary, of op-eds, of speeches, of analyses discussing which country may, could, should, will next develop a nuclear arsenal. And sometimes these analyses may seem quite extreme in their frequency or even their supposed certainty and even diversity, given they're talking about many different countries. But what we can say, though, is that they are highlighting quite a worrying trend that we're seeing, particularly that the International Nuclear Non-Proliferation Order that has existed for more than 60 years now, and that's intended to prevent any new countries from joining the nuclear club. That order is very much fraying from many different sides. There are more and more incentives for states to acquire nuclear weapons, whereas incentives for nuclear weapon states to disarm are few. The diplomatic space needed to find compromises is also shrinking, and alliance mechanisms that also serve to a certain extent as a non-proliferation mechanism are very much under pressure. So today's web talk is intended to provide some much needed, I think, stock taking and analysis of where we currently stand in terms of nuclear risk and the future of governance mechanisms. And we'll do that by doing a bit of a tour d'horizon of some of those key trends and developments, starting with the state of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Then we'll turn to developments in the Middle East, where the war in Iran continues without a nuclear agreement in sight, and where at the same time the US also seems to be on the cusp of finalizing a civil nuclear cooperation deal with Saudi Arabia that may provide Riyadh with some proliferation sensitive technologies. After the Middle East, we'll turn a little bit more to Northeast Asia, where North Korea's nuclear program continues to progress, before we turn to the much discussed concept of friendly proliferation. So, whereby allies of the United States could perhaps in the future acquire nuclear capabilities with Washington's assent or even support. And so that's a lot to cover in about an hour. Um, so I am very much immensely grateful that we have two fantastic experts on nuclear nonproliferation here today to dissect and debate these issues. So I'm very happy to welcome Kelsey Davenport. She is the Director for Nonproliferation Policy at the Arms Control Association in Washington, D.C., where she focuses on efforts to prevent nuclear proliferation and nuclear terrorism, and she is one of the leading experts on Iran's nuclear program, North Korea's nuclear missile programs, as well as emerging proliferation risks in the Middle East and East Asia. And I'm also immensely grateful to welcome Daria Doldzikova, who is a senior research fellow with the London-based Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, with its proliferation and nuclear policy program. So her work covers issues of nuclear proliferation, nuclear deterrence, nuclear safety and security, and strategic aspects of civil nuclear supply chains. She has currently done a lot of work on Iran's nuclear program, as well as the role of nuclear deterrence in Euro-Atlantic security dynamics. So Kelsey, Daria, welcome to you both. Let me double check I haven't missed something. Nope, all good. We'll start by having a bit of a moderated discussion where we'll go through all four of these bigger areas I outlined, and then in about half an hour or so, we'll also take questions from the audience. So wherever you are, feel free to write questions in the chat, and then we will either insert them in the conversation, or I'll make sure that we have some time to cover them at around 3:40 Zurich time. So in about, again, half an hour, and then we'll make sure to finish on time because we are a Swiss-based organization. Our reputation cannot be sullied by a Belgian on the reins of this moderation. With that, again, I'll start us off with maybe discussing a little bit the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We had the 2026 NPT review conference last June, ending without a consensus final document. This was the third NPT review conference in a row that ended without a consensus document. Given how important the NPT is and remains for multilateral nuclear governance, how should we be interpreting these different failures? I'm seeing too many op-eds that look like an obituary of the NPT. I don't think that's the case, but is the treaty increasingly becoming irrelevant? And what are the risks for non-proliferation? Maybe Kelsey, if you can start us off.
Well, thank you so much to CSS for hosting this. It's a pleasure to be here, and of course to appear with Daria. So, if we look at the NPT in its entirety, from a non-proliferation perspective, it really has been remarkably successful. And a number of factors contribute to that success. But I would say one of the most critical is that there have been unity amongst the P5 or the recognized nuclear weapon states on the prioritization of nonproliferation and how to respond to proliferation risks. So the P5 have utilized the accountability mechanisms laid out in the NPT, working through the IAEA's Board of Governors, reporting to the Security Council, using Security Council resolutions to impose costs and set a pathway for diplomacy, and generally refrained from using the NPT RevCon as a forum for addressing particular nonproliferation or particular proliferation risks. I fear we're moving away from that period where individual P5 states are prioritizing national interests over these shared norms and willing to use international forums now to name and shame particular states when that may not be kind of the best path forward. And we saw this play out at the NPT. I mean, the US insisted on specifically naming Iran. And to be fair, Iran is in violation of its NPT required safeguards agreements. There is legitimate concern there. But this is not going to be resolved. The Iran nuclear crisis, Iran's safeguards issues are not going to be resolved in the NPT review conference. So this move towards trying to politicize the forum to address a particular state is, I think, concerning. And that's really why we saw no consensus final document for the third time in a row. And certainly the failure to get a consensus final document is concerning. The failure to get it 3 times in a row is very concerning. And as you noted, states are questioning the value of the NPT. But a final document is not the only measure of the NPT's health. And arguably, had the states reached a final document that papered over or ignored some of the key issues that risk undermining the treaty, you can make an argument that that's also damaging, right? That the failure to fully address and debate some of those key issues can have an effect. So certainly, I think there's reason to be concerned about the NPT. There's reason to be concerned about the health of nonproliferation and its relevance going forward. But I'd focus less on the absence of a final document and more on the fact that, again, this P5 unity is eroding, that it's going to be more challenging to hold states for accountable for violations, and that Iran has demonstrated this key gap in the NPT. And that is that states can move to the threshold of nuclear weapons while remaining in compliance with the NPT. And as I mentioned, I know Iran has safeguards issues, but the question of moving to the threshold, I think Iran has demonstrated and really did that over the past several years without actually violating those core NPT obligations. So, that I would say is the bigger threat. How do we think about accountability? How do we think about enforcement in an age when we don't have P5 unity? And how do we think about that going forward when states may try to utilize this gap in the NPT to move to the threshold of nuclear weapons while evading consequences?
Maybe a quick follow-up already. I'm starting to move away. But does the NPT, in your opinion, offer some of that flexibility that is needed to push on these accountability and enforcement measures? Or is it just too set in its format? Because a lot of criticism I hear is also sometimes about the format itself.
I think it is certainly worth debating if the structure of the review conference process is fit for the current security environment. And I would argue that it's not. I mean, certainly there still is value in trying to reach consensus on steps to strengthen implementation of the NPT. But I don't think that should be the only path forward to laying out specific actions that states can be taking to advance the treaty. I would like to move to a format where we see, kind of multiple different, products, for want of a better word, coming out of the review conference. In addition to the final document, could we have something akin to the nuclear security summits, where groups of states made multilateral commitments that went beyond the status quo to advance areas of shared interest? And that could be a way to address some of these specific issues more flexibly, to build support for actions that go kind of beyond the status quo over time, and eventually kind of pressure states to be willing to take, more steps to strengthen and further implement the treaty.
Thank you. Daria, how have you been following then this NPT review conference process? And do you also share some of the same concerns and also, I guess, reasons also for optimism that I think Kelsey has outlined?
Yeah, I mean, I think Kelsey's outlined kind of some of the key, like you said, challenges and reasons for optimism quite well, as well as some of the restrictions in our own thinking around precisely what constitutes the continued success of the NPT. And I think that's where I come back to is, it's the fact that we're talking about the NPT in the context of what's going on in Iran at the moment, right? So there were remarks that came out of the senior leadership recently around in Iran around, potentially moving towards, they alluded to the idea of, they might move towards a nuclear weapons capability. I mean, they keep floating this all the time, so I wouldn't start worrying about it too much. But in the same breath, the NPT was mentioned, right? So Iran mentioned that, they feel that what they're doing under the NPT in terms of protection of nuclear facilities that are safeguarded, and we can debate over whether or not those protections exist and to what extent Iran actually kind of falls under the bucket of countries that are safeguarding their facilities. But the point being, right, that we keep coming back to the NPT, even in reference in instances where we feel that the NPT is actually not performing perhaps as well as we would like it to be, or perhaps has some gaps. When we talk about proliferation and potential friendly proliferation, whether it be in Asia or in Europe, and I know we'll come back to that. Again, we consistently keep coming back to the fact of, well, what does this mean for, what would this mean for those states under the NPT? The fact that we're referencing the NPT and the additional protocol and the lack thereof, and, a US-Saudi agreement, the fact that this is still very much kind of at the, it is still seen, the NPT is still seen as the foundation of the international non-proliferation regime. And that's not necessarily a given. There are alternatives that have come up over time, thinking of the TPNW in particular. So things could have gone a different way, but the fact that we are still referring to the NPT as kind of the foundation of the non-proliferation regime, and the fact that countries are still, like I said, heeding the NPT obligations are, I think, noteworthy. What I would flag, and Kelsey had alluded to this as well, is the need to, and it's easier said than done, but the need to look at the importance of addressing the concerns of the non-nuclear weapon states, and they're very different across the NPT, right? And I think part of that, I think, dovetails quite nicely with some of the conversations that we're having in Europe. So, the non-nuclear weapon states that benefit from a nuclear umbrella and that see value in nuclear deterrence and want nuclear deterrence to play a greater role in their security. Part of the efforts to make sure that they don't engage in proliferation activities themselves is addressing kind of some of those security challenges potentially in the conventional space. And again, I know we'll come back to this, but also there's discussion obviously going on in the global south and other states that look at that are concerned about disarmament and the need to move, or rather the lack of movement towards disarmament, and the need to kind of address those challenges because, again, the NPT is, yes, it's still stable. That's not necessarily given. There is a movement towards the TPNW, et cetera. And if states see frustration with the current state of the NPT, there is the option they might move towards that. So I think it's trying to not separate non-proliferation and the health of the NPT and deterrence issues as two separate things. I think they're part and parcel of the same conversation. And I think maybe shifting the lens will help kind of underline how the NPT is actually and should be part of the discussion that we're now having that is a little bit more focused on nuclear deterrence, certainly in the European context.
But you don't, for instance, see any imminent withdrawals from the NPT. Or what I also am personally more worried about is just many states investing less and less diplomatic effort, resources in it. And so it's just starting to wither a lot. But a withdrawal would also be on many different grounds, obviously, would also, I think, create a lot of chaos. Do you see that as something on the horizon? Or as you say, states are just still looking at the NPT so much as that foundation that it would be too much of a risk? Wait, sorry, that was a bit. All right, I'm hearing you very blah. Mm, wait, am I the only one? Kelsey, are you also hearing Daria with strange things, or is it just me?
Yeah, it's a bit muddled for me too.
Sorry, we're hearing very muddled. Now you're muted. Unmute. In the distance, unfortunately. Maybe. Would you happen to have maybe some headphones or on the chat? Let me see. Otherwise, let me turn a little bit to Kelsey for a little bit. Aha, yes. Let's do that. Let's then switch already gears towards the Middle East. We've already mentioned Iran quite a few times, and the issues around Iran and around Iran safeguards problems being also at one of the main reasons why the US decided to then politicize it and push for it in the NPT context. But at the moment, no further negotiations have taken place around Iran's nuclear program. The war still continues. Maybe, Kelsey, can you give us like your assessment at the moment of the situation, and also particularly looking at the likelihood of in the future, in the near future, hopefully finding an agreement that could reinstate particularly some guardrails and some much needed transparency, because that's also what we have lost over the course of the last year.
Yes, of course. So I'll be interested in Daria's view on this, but my opinion now is that I'm actually perhaps slightly more optimistic that Iran is not going to withdraw from the NPT in response to the illegal US and Israeli strikes than I was a year ago. I think if there was going to be kind of an immediate withdrawal and move towards nuclear weapons, we would have seen it already in response to the attacks of June 2025. I mean, right now, Iran is paying a remarkably high price for a nuclear weapon it does not have. And I think that, again, if it saw security benefits from nuclear deterrence at this point, we would have already seen some movements toward that. And instead, what we're seeing is Iran, I think, double down on the leverage that it can gain, that it can utilize by controlling the Straits of Hormuz. And I think Iran's leverage in this space was always suspected, but now Iran is really beginning to understand how it can utilize that as a tool of economic pressure and coercion. But at the end of the day, no matter how this conflict ends or maybe doesn't even formally end, I mean, Iran is going to retain the materials, the technologies necessary to build a nuclear weapon. And there are going to be factions in Iran that continue to advocate for a bomb. And we've seen those factions, I would say, grow in some of their strength and support, as a result of these illegal strikes. So there's going to be internal pressures. There are also going to be new verification challenges to actually determining, what's left of Iran's nuclear program, because of the US and Israeli strikes, because of the gap in IAEA monitoring. So I would say we're really facing an unprecedented situation. So, while I'm maybe more optimistic that Iran isn't going to withdraw from the NPT, I am maybe more pessimistic about the likelihood of getting an effective nuclear agreement because the US has so little credibility, understandably so, in its negotiations with Iran, under the Trump administration. And because there are these newfound verification challenges that, if not correctly addressed at the onset of an agreement, I think could undermine a deal, going forward. If, for instance, the IAEA cannot reestablish some credible baseline inventories for centrifuges, for the nuclear material stockpile, any significant degree of uncertainty that emerges down the road, particularly if there are perceived gaps in a monitoring and verification regime, I mean, that's going to give, the United States or any critics of the deal, an opportunity to pull out of an agreement again. Right. So I think there are technical challenges to reaching a deal. There are political challenges to reaching a deal. I think Trump, I would say, is losing interest in negotiations. He does not have the patience. He does not appear willing to empower a technical team to actually negotiate in detail on this deal. So I think all of that is reducing the likelihood of a nuclear agreement. So I fear that through the duration of the Trump administration, we are going to kind of remain in this murky, we're not completely at war, but not actively pursuing negotiation space, while each side tries to kind of rebuild and consolidate leverage, perhaps looking towards the next US administration.
Daria, do you want to jump back in?
Sure. Is that any better?
Fantastic.
Aha,
Please.
there you go. Had someone drop off some microphones. Yeah, so I mean, I think, again, Kelsey's covered it quite well. I think when we're looking at, so first of all, I think it's worth dividing, will Iran pull out of the NPT and will Iran develop a nuclear weapon, right? Because those are two separate things. And if both of those things are sources of leverage for Iran or sources of coercion, right, those are different levers in a way, or different points on, if you want to use the analogy of the escalation ladder, right, in this context. They're different kind of levers that Iran could use. So, Iran could pull out of the NPT without actually deciding to build a nuclear weapon. That would put it in a very difficult position, particularly now, right? So Iran has threatened repeatedly to pull out of the NPT in the past. However, during those threats, for the most part, we had IAEA access to the Iranian nuclear program, right? So if Iran was to threaten to pull out of the NPT, the IAEA could still verify that, they're not moving towards, as far as they could tell, a nuclear weapon. So we had that level of transparency. Now, threatening to pull out of the NPT for the Iranians would be a much stronger signal, because we don't have the transparency of the program anymore to verify that it's just a threat and that they're not actually actively moving towards a nuclear weapon. In terms of the incentives for Iran to weaponize or not, it's I've been saying this sort of since the attacks last June, but I think, and I think it remains true, there's sort of these competing incentives now, right? So, I mean, first of all, we look at the technical capability of Iran to actually at this point develop a nuclear weapon, and then the kind of the more strategic incentives. And on the technical side of things, again, it's very difficult to tell. We knew where Iran was prior to the June attacks. We knew that they had the fissile material that they would have needed to eventually move towards a nuclear weapon, but they would have had to enrich it further, et cetera. So in terms of, and then there's the whole weaponization aspect of it. So they weren't, ages off, but they weren't quite at, as far as we could tell, as far as the intelligence community had, was telling us, they hadn't actually made the decision to weaponize, and there are probably still kind of bits and pieces that they would have needed some work on. But we don't know where that is, right? Because the IAEA hasn't really had access to certainly the enrichment facilities for well over a year now. And even before that, there were gaps in the IAEA's and therefore our understanding of what the Iranian program actually looks like. And again, we don't know what the extent of the damage is to the facilities. At the same time, we know that it doesn't take a massive site for them to engage in the enrichment and potentially the weaponization activities that they might need to engage in if they did decide to finally move towards a nuclear weapon. How much of the Israeli intelligence access is still in place, since the attacks of last year, and certainly since the start of the war in February. So there's big questions on the technical side of things. And then again, like I said, there's these kind of competing strategic considerations for Iran. On the one hand side, and you can interpret this differently, but on the one hand side, you could argue that Iran could now be a textbook case for, having every incentive there might be to move towards a nuclear weapon, right? There's been attacks on the leadership. There's been a full-scale war against the country, right? It's being squeezed economically, militarily, et cetera. Its missile capabilities, even though, as far as we can tell, they've not been completely eliminated, they've certainly been degraded. So, is the nuclear weapon now the only ultimate last deterrent that Iran has to prevent, a further continuation or escalation of the conflict? Having said that, the war is already kind of at full scale for Iran. The regime has already been, decapitated, and yet the regime persists, right? And the state persists. And by some accounts, Iran might actually come out of this war stronger in the region, a stronger position than it had been before. So, is then the risk of finally pushing towards a nuclear weapon, with all of that considered, with the leverage that is clearly demonstrated in the Strait of Hormuz, does it make sense for them to move towards a nuclear weapon, which would create greater risks for them going forward? So I see kind of competing incentives there as well. So it's not an easy question to answer, I guess.
No, thank you. I think that adds, as you say, it would be an interesting test case, and there's, I think, a lot of debate on then what would make sense. I think in the interest. Oh no, please.
Sorry, just one last final point.
Yeah.
I know we're kind of pushing against time, but I think the other question that we need to consider is, with regard to Iranian withdrawal from the NPT, it would be hard to argue that Iran is currently in compliance with the NPT, considering that it's not allowing IAEA access to its facilities. So to go back to the earlier conversation, for the health of the NPT, and it's an open question, is it better to have Iran part of the NPT but not complying with its CSA obligations, or would it actually be better for the health of the NPT to kind of to carve out a state that's not compliant? And I think there's a healthy debate to be had on both sides.
Debate we might come back to, but first I do want to, first of all, remind participants they can ask questions in the chat that we'll pick up on later, and then also turn our attention to, I guess, the other big development coming out in the Middle East, which is this announcement of a deal that has then been agreed between the US and Saudi Arabia on civil nuclear energy, where there seem to be absolutely no restrictions in terms of access to enrichment capabilities, and also very limited involvement of the IAEA, and definitely no signing of an additional protocol for Saudi Arabia, which the additional protocol being that highest standard of nuclear safeguards that all states are definitely encouraged to sign up to. So maybe turning back to Kelsey, and then I know, Daria, you also have some thoughts on that, but what what more? I know there's some details missing about this deal, but so far, what can we kind of infer from if this deal does go ahead? I know it has to go through Congress, but having this lack of restrictions on enrichment in a region that's already a can of worms when it comes to nuclear issues, no additional protocol. Does that kind of entail for also the role of the IAEA? And is there just this risk of setting a precedent? And like, yeah, I'll leave it up to you.
Yeah, I think there are a number of reasons to be concerned about this agreement from a non-proliferation perspective. So first, if we look at the question of enrichment, what this deal is likely to do if it goes through is to create a 2-year study period for the US and Saudi Arabia to consider if enrichment in Saudi Arabia is commercially viable. Now, Saudi Arabia really wants uranium enrichment. So I don't think this is going to be a serious study. I think there's going to be kind of a pre-cooked understanding of what this agreement or what this study will produce. But if the study does determine yes, enrichment, the US is then going to build what is referred to as a black box enrichment facility in Saudi Arabia. And the Trump administration is arguing that this type of facility, which is built and operated by the United States, does not pose a proliferation risk because Saudi Arabia does not have direct access to the technology. I fail to be reassured by the Trump administration's arguments here. I mean, how can you guarantee the security of this facility if there's unrest in Saudi Arabia, if there's a rupture between the US and Saudi Arabia? Could the facility be nationalized? That's a huge risk. But there's also concerns about just the day-to-day, leaks of information that could happen when you're talking about, regulating and safeguarding something like an enrichment facility. Saudi Arabia is still going to have to provide information to the IAEA about this facility. The nuclear regulator in Saudi Arabia may have questions. So even if there's no, deliberate, decision to leak this technology, Saudi Arabia is going to learn about the enrichment process. And then again, this is going to be subject to, beyond the NPT required safeguards agreement, a US Saudi bilateral safeguards agreement rather than the additional protocol. And the Trump administration is arguing that this bilateral safeguards agreement is sufficient. Again, I am not reassured. They have provided no information about how this compares to the additional protocol, and no information about what's going to happen at sites that are not subject to either the CSA with the IAEA or the bilateral safeguards agreement. The bilateral safeguards agreement is only going to apply to sites where there's joint US-Saudi activity. So if Saudi Arabia starts mining uranium, who is going to inspect and access that site? And these are critical questions because the US is considering handing enrichment technology to a country that has threatened to build nuclear weapons if Iran does. And as we just discussed, there's significant uncertainties about what Iran might do. Now, if the 2-year study concludes that enrichment is not feasible, which I suppose is an option, 10 years after that, Saudi Arabia can pursue enrichment either domestically or with a foreign partner. That, I think, is probably the worst case scenario, because then we have enrichment with no bilateral safeguards and no additional protocol. So in general, I think nuclear cooperation can be a very powerful tool for non-proliferation. The US should be rethinking how it uses nuclear cooperation, but not like this. I mean, this is just, I think, setting up another proliferation threat in the region, and making a deal with Iran more difficult. Iran is not going to want to agree to things that Saudi Arabia is not doing. So very concerning.
Daria, do you want to jump in?
Just to say that, yeah, I mean, I share a lot of the same concerns that Kelsey has. I think there is, precisely as Kelsey said, I think there's good reason for the US to pursue nuclear cooperation with Saudi Arabia, not least because if the US doesn't, the Russians and the Chinese will. I highly doubt that their non-proliferation expectations of Saudi Arabia will be stricter than those that even, allegedly are in this Trump agreement. So, plus there's kind of considerations around broader strategic influence of the Russians, the Chinese get a foothold in Saudi's nuclear energy sector. So I think from that perspective, yes, I think the US should be pursuing, nuclear cooperation with Saudi. I think it's a good thing, precisely as Kelsey said. not in the way that it's doing now.
Mm.
Historically, we've known countries to transfer over presumably civil nuclear technology to states that were allies or were friendly. And, after a while, that is no longer the case. The US transfer of nuclear technology to Iran in the 1950s is an excellent example of that. I appreciate very different context, but nevertheless, just to say that relationships between states change, and once that technology is in the country, it's in the country, and you can make all kinds of promises around it's a black box, it's whatever. But at the end of the day, governments and political situations in countries change very quickly. And I think in addition to, the proliferation concern around transferring that technology to a state that has threatened to develop nuclear weapons under certain conditions, I think it sets a very dangerous precedent of states negotiating kind of ad hoc bilateral safeguards agreements, as opposed to relying to what is already there and is already robust, which is the IAEA Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement, the additional protocol, like that's been negotiated and is really, the gold standard. And I use that in lowercase gold standard for non-proliferation. So you open up the door for these kind of ad hoc bespoke agreements. The Russians, the Chinese are going to start doing that too with countries that we are perhaps even more concerned about taking advantage of that.
I might add in one of the questions from the audience now as well. I think it's a good time, like when talking about, for instance, a potential then deal with Iran, or also how the IAEA, I think, is developing safeguards and agreements. And I think more broadly, there was a question on how also some new technologies like AI and cyber are then also perhaps changing the way some agreements could be monitored and verified. I don't know if you both would have an opinion on that. Sorry, I thought I would bring it in here.
No, generally, you would just think, full stop. The IAEA is the only institution that should be safeguarding nuclear programs, or I should say the primary institution. And that, the use of, new technologies, the use of, AI, other mechanisms, should be explored within the IAEA context of applying safeguards, not as a substitute for on the ground IAEA inspections and support for IAEA access. So I think some of these new technologies have potential, but again, I think they need to be kind of carefully vetted through the IAEA process to ensure that all member states have confidence in how these tools are being used, and to ensure that we're not cutting out this long established expertise and understanding that the IAEA has spent, decades building. I mean, at the end of the day, when it comes to assessing, whether a country is violating its safeguards agreement, I mean, I want a human set of eyes and a human mind, reviewing whatever conclusions, AI, might be coming to. And again, the IAEA is the best place to do this for many reasons, including, what Daria, spoke about earlier when it comes to precedent.
I muted myself. Keeping the time in mind, and that's why I kind of put in a question there from the audience. Let us turn a bit to Asia. We might not be able to cover everything, but North Korea, when I wrote these questions, was not really in the news so much. It's back in the news now. There's always an opportunity to discuss North Korea's nuclear program. And I think it kind of also brings us back to some of the conversations about then perhaps non-proliferation at large, role of the NPT. But so we've seen North Korea continuing to expand its nuclear capabilities. We've seen also then potentially, I think that this is still not fully verified or confirmed, but more and more cooperation with Russia, a NPT state, a nuclear weapon state. I was wondering also to maybe have both of your assessments on how this is influencing security dynamics in the region, how if this is also raising some proliferation risks and questions in terms of, we've seen this in the past, of course, with North Korea and proliferation networks. So what is your current assessment there? Maybe Daria, would you like to start, or?
I might leave this one to Kelsey. I'll be honest, I've only been following Asia kind of very tangentially, so I'll let Kelsey take this one.
Thanks.
Sure. So as you noted, I mean, North Korea has been taking steps not only to expand its nuclear weapons program, but solidify the role that nuclear weapons play in its security perceptions. Right. And this includes not only developing nuclear weapons systems to deter attack, but also to repel an attack in the event that deterrence fails. So we're seeing North Korea invest in a wide range of delivery systems and expanding its warheads. But North Korea's nuclear developments don't happen in a vacuum, right? And I think we need to look at the Northeast Asian region more as an escalating spiral of kind of actions that kind of reinforce additional investments in systems, nuclear in terms of North Korea, but conventional in the other states. I mean, North Korea is responding to an expanded missile defense footprint in the region. It's responding to South Korean investments in ballistic missiles. It's expanding to, Japan, rethinking some of its, security and defense posture. So I would say it's kind of locked in this spiral of escalation. And at the backdrop, then these states in the region are re-examining whether the U.S. alliance is credible. And whether the United States can be counted on as a reliable security partner. So that's further driving some of these domestic developments. And then, on top of that, I think we have, an increasing concern that North Korea's, strengthened relationship with Russia is not only allowing it to improve its vertical proliferation, right? So it's learning about missile performance in the Russia-Ukrainian theater that it can then apply to its own arsenal. But that it's risks setting the precedent that if you as a state develops nuclear weapons, refuses to, give them up over a longer period of time, and strengthens your bond with a recognized nuclear weapons state, that you can be accepted as a nuclear armed state. That's a dangerous precedent. It also, the increasing Russia North Korean relationship, as it also reduces North Korea's incentive to negotiate. Right? If North Korea is getting what it needs for the regime to survive from Russia, that's putting more pressure on China to try to repair its relationship with North Korea. We've seen that play out in recent years. Then it's not going to need the United States. It's not going to need South Korea as much. So again, less incentive to negotiate there if it can get what it needs elsewhere. So not in the news that much. I'm not. I think what we've seen about a possible Trump-Kim summit might be more of a flash in the pan than likely to play out over the next several months, because not much incentive on the North Korean side. But certainly we should be paying more attention to the region and thinking more strategically about how to assess these risks.
Thank you. And I think that sort of answers a question I just saw pop up in the chat, that given that North Korea is treated as a de facto nuclear state, while Iran's program has faced military and economic containment, this does send a bit of a double standard signal to other regional powers about what you can do when you have pulled out of the NPT and then reached up negotiating power through a full deterrence capability. I will turn now maybe to the question of friendly proliferation, just based on the time we have, because I think we have touched a bit upon all these questions of what it would also mean, what the impact currently on the NPT of nuclear weapon states, non-nuclear weapon states, but allies of the US, and those discussions also have on those dynamics. So I do want to bring it there, and I know that this idea of friendly proliferation has increasingly gained ground in a lot of discussions. I know we differentiated with nuclear hedging, with nuclear latency. There's a lot of different concepts thrown about, but this is becoming one of those more and more likely scenarios as well. There's the Iran one that I think Daria kind of outlined, where it could become an interesting, a particular case there of a reason why a country would then really go fully to a nuclear capability. But the other scenarios we're currently kind of seeing and discussing are more South Korea, Poland, and so maybe then bringing Daria back here in the conversation, how how much should we how much should we think about this concept of friendly proliferation? How likely are some of these US allies to really seek a domestic nuclear program? Because we know, of course, it depends on the solidity of the alliance with the US, which is very much under pressure, and a lot of other regional security imperatives. But what should we expect at the moment, in your opinion?
Yeah, so I think the conversations are slightly different among Asian allies and European allies and within Europe itself. So, I'd like to not be too alarmist. So my bias is always to assume that this is primarily political signaling rather than any kind of indication of intent to actually develop nuclear weapons. And I mean, some of the rhetoric that we see coming out of capitals, both in Asia and in Europe, around, the need to consider all possible weapons, I think is the way that the Polish, I think it was president a couple of years ago, had put it. And certainly there's certainly this revival of a debate that's been going on for quite some time in Japan and in South Korea around the potential need to move towards their own nuclear weapons capabilities. Again, my perhaps overly optimistic tendency is to assume that that is, largely kind of more political signaling over the concern over the health of the U.S. nuclear umbrella. However, when we talk about Japan and South Korea, like I said, these are longstanding debates, and when it comes to kind of technological capability, these are states that it is feasible to consider one of these states moving eventually towards a nuclear weapons capability just based on technical capability. Like the technical capability is quite advanced in those countries. Capabilities around the delivery system, so in South Korea in particular, and their missile systems, quite an advanced program. So I think, but again, I'm not an expert on Asia, so I won't delve too far into that. But when it comes to Europe, I think, again, a lot of that is political signaling. The technological capability, be it in the Baltics, in the Nordics, in Poland, is just not there. Like they don't have the nuclear, they can't develop them. They just don't have the nuclear fuel cycles to develop nuclear weapons capabilities. We can talk about some exceptions in Sweden, for instance, but broadly speaking, I think it's a far way off. And if any of those countries was to ever push towards a nuclear weapon, that would get picked up pretty quickly by ideally the International Atomic Energy Agency, other intelligence agencies. I just don't think it would quite get that far. And again, the NPT is still seen as an important restraint on any kind of serious conversations around that. But what I do think sometimes is underestimated, in particular when I talk to folks in the US, is the extent to which these political conversations are actually happening, right? And just because, I'm not particularly concerned over Poland developing a nuclear weapon tomorrow, the fact that yes, these are still fringe conversations, but I think they were less fringe than some folks in the US, for instance, actually realize, because there are serious concerns about in certain parts of NATO over the continued threat from Russia and the willingness of the United States to actually intervene. Now, in the meantime, the solution to those concerns is being addressed through greater investments into conventional capabilities and more creative thinking around both for the US, how to make the US nuclear deterrent more credible, and in particular, how the UK and France make their contribution to European security through nuclear deterrence more credible and more visible to allies. So that's kind of where that conversation is. When we look at Poland, for instance, and then talk about, the role that nuclear weapons play in their security, that is still very much kind of that conversation around, does Poland want to contribute as, to dual capable aircraft mission, for instance, and is that feasible? So that's where the conversation is. But I think what is slightly dangerous is a tendency on the part of the US that I'm perceiving to try to compensate for what is a conventional, or talk of a conventional, withdrawal from Europe, and some of the rhetoric that we're seeing around US conventional commitments to Europe, to compensate for that by saying, yes, but leave all that to the side. The fact that we're doing a review of our conventional posture in Europe doesn't impact on the fact that the US nuclear umbrella stays intact. And it it is still, or the kind of the extended deterrent is still there, and it is still there. But I think there's a little bit of whether it be wishful thinking or denial over the fact that you can't actually divorce those two parts of the conversation, right? Reducing the credibility of the conventional deterrent or defense that the US provides to Europe has a direct impact on the effectiveness of the nuclear deterrent, potentially in practical terms, but certainly in kind of the rhetoric and the credibility that the US would be willing to risk potential, escalation and potential nuclear use by Russia against the US to defend Europe. And on the flip side, I think there is a little bit of again wishful thinking sometimes on the part of the European states, or perhaps just lack of other options to accept that, and to kind of fall back on this idea that yes, well, the nuclear extended deterrent is still there, and we're still reliant on it, or that perhaps in a future administration you won't have the same kind of rhetoric from the United States around even retrenchment in the conventional space, and the US will be back in Europe. And I think that is and it's certainly not happening across all European in all kind of European corners. There's a lot of investment going into conventional defense, which again, and thinking into how to strengthen European nuclear deterrence. But I am afraid that there's a little bit of kind of looking forward and thinking that, oh, maybe this will change, in 2, 3, 4 years' time. Whereas the damage on the political credibility to the extended deterrent, the US extended deterrent, I think has been done. And we need to, I say we sitting in Europe because I'm sitting in London despite my accent, to have a think about how do we make nuclear deterrence credible kind of on the European continent without I don't want to say without the US nuclear umbrella, but with a US nuclear parasol, let's say, a much more transparent extended nuclear deterrent.
I like this term, nuclear parasol. I generally don't like the term nuclear umbrella, but if we're throwing in a parasol in there as well. Kelsey, did you want to jump in on the friendly proliferation debates in DC? Otherwise, I'll bring in some questions from our audience as well on the NPT. So I have one question here regarding tangible recommendations to NPT member states for the next review cycle, and specifically how this next gap year could be best spent, and perhaps a second one as well. How, and that's maybe for Daria, how has French developments, France removing, I think it says removing the cap on its nuclear arsenal, not exactly, but has definitely committed to an increase in its nuclear capabilities. How is this affecting the NPT and REFCON dynamics? And I guess this plays also into the broader just rearming trends as well. So perhaps Kelsey first.
Sure. I'll try to be quick. So first, I would say use the gap year to try to find a way to bring Iran back into compliance with its safeguards obligations, or at least to begin that process. Because so long as Iran is violating its safeguards obligations, there's a risk that a single state will use Iran to disrupt any future RevCon. So I would focus on that specifically. The second thing I would do is that I do not think the NPT is prepared to address the rise in interest in nuclear energy and what that's going to mean for proliferation risk if we stay on the same trajectory of all states, or many more states, wanting domestic enrichment and reprocessing. So I would start to think substantively about how do we answer the demand of growing interest for nuclear energy in a way that reduces proliferation risks? How can we think about regional or multilateral processes for the production and guarantee of nuclear fuel that, again, demonstrates to states that there's value in remaining part of the NPT, that it's not going to infringe on their guaranteed right to civil nuclear technology, and without driving those proliferation risks. And I'd also, again, as I said before, start to have the structural conversation about how can we advance the NPT outside of a final document in that review process? Are there other mechanisms to lay out specific steps? I think yes, but I would have the conversation now.
Thank you. Daria?
Yeah, in terms of practicalities for the next NPT review cycle, I think, again, going back to what Kelsey said, thinking through some of these new challenges that have emerged to the NPT, in particular, the question around how do we deal with a program that looks to be a hedging program. So something like what Iran had, right? When you get really close to what would be necessary for a nuclear weapon, but technically, the program's not been is not a nuclear weapons program. After the experience in Iraq, there was sort of a review of the IAEA safeguards procedures, and that's, where the additional protocol kind of came from. Do we need to have a similar discussion around, an additional protocol plus of some sort? Now, that'll be very difficult to implement. The international sort of system is in a very different place. International consensus is in a very different place than it was than it had been when the AP came in. But I think, kind of thinking through, what do we do? What do we do with hedgers? Also an issue that, I've followed closely, which is attacks on nuclear facilities and threats to nuclear facilities. I think it's a really difficult one because there's competing sort of perspectives on what would be sufficient in terms of providing protections to civilian facilities or safeguarded facilities. But I think that that's an issue that it's a very difficult one to tackle because, again, there's a lot of there's kind of competing interests in that. But I think it's one that effort needs to go into trying to resolve, because I think that's where a lot of, that's certainly an issue that Iran has leveraged to, or has pointed to say that other states are not kind of respecting its own, respecting its rights under the NPT, which again is debatable. But so I think that's an issue that probably needs to get tackled, and some energy needs to go into that. In terms of the implications of France's nuclear forward deterrence, how they've termed it, efforts and the implications of that for the NPT. This is part of a much larger conversation around non-nuclear weapon states, or non-nuclear weapon states feeling frustrated over the turn that the conversation on nuclear weapons and progress on nuclear disarmament has taken, not just, in the last year or two, but, going back some time. We had similar concerns when the UK said that it was going to be raising the cap on its nuclear weapon numbers. So I think it goes part and parcel into, like I said, this larger frustration from states that the nuclear weapon states are not complying with their responsibilities under the NPT. But at the same time, I think we also need to be careful not to I guess, misrepresent what forward deterrence actually is and what nuclear sharing under NATO is. The Russians tend to like to do that. And there's these accusations of it not being compliant with the NPT. So I think we just need to be careful to point to the fact that, yes, there are legitimate concerns on the part of non-nuclear weapon states, but also kind of that this is not perhaps what the Russians accuse it of being sometimes, which is, proliferation, et cetera. Is actually, the aim is to do the opposite, to prevent further friendly proliferation.
Thank you both. I'm afraid we won't be able to get into all the other questions. I always try and close on a bit of a note of optimism. So I would maybe ask, and I think you've actually given a few notes of optimism throughout. It's usually a bit darker, these conversations, but I'd like to ask maybe each of you to give me one particular development or even a piece of work or analysis, project or initiative that makes you quite hopeful in terms of how we are working to preserve and even reinforce non-proliferation norms despite all these trends. Is something you can think of in particular. It can even be just a speech or an article that you read recently. Something comes to mind, feel free. Oh, trick question. No.
Hmm. I think I'll come back to what we were saying at the start of this, that I think in part it's our jobs to search out the challenges and the issues and the things that aren't going well. But broadly speaking, like I said at the start, I do think it's promising the fact that, we still do keep referencing the NPT and the norm against further proliferation when we come to discussions around, how to strengthen security in Europe or what Iran plans to do, right? The fact that it is still seen as crossing a red line to pull out of the NPT, or to have public conversations around, Poland or the Nordics developing nuclear weapons. The fact that that is still seen as a red line, or something that goes against what are established international norms. I do think that does carry some weight. So that provides some optimism for me that that norm still holds, and will hopefully be reinforced in the coming years.
Thank you. Kelsey, you have the final word?
No, I certainly agree with Daria that if we aren't looking at specific cases and zoom out, I would still say there's general consensus that nonproliferation is important, and that the NPT really is irreplaceable, as flawed as it is. But I would also say, maybe more specifically, the debate that's coming in Congress over the Saudi agreement, it may be a much needed opportunity in Washington to rethink the U.S. approach to nonproliferation, to move away from kind of the over reliance on coercion and sanctions, and have kind of this necessary discussion about the relationship between nuclear cooperation and nuclear power, and how the U.S. can support nonproliferation. So I'm hopeful that could be a moment for rethinking.
No, fantastic answers, both of you. And thank you then very much for investing the time and effort today to respond to really all these different questions and areas of work, and doing so very comprehensively. Thank you also to and everyone who joined this event, and for asking some really interesting questions. Sorry we did not get to all of them. That's my terrible job as a timekeeper moderator. And also, of course, a big thank you to my CSS colleagues and the communications team for making this talk possible. So you'll be able to find a recording of this event on our website in a few days. So if you know someone who would be interested and couldn't join, feel free to share it. And please also check out the wonderful websites of the Arms Control Association, RUSI, and of course the CSS for some more work and analysis on these issues. And as you'll see on the screen now, you can learn more about some CSS events and publications by subscribing to our newsletter or following us on LinkedIn. And with that, with only 3 minutes late, I would like to wish you all a very lovely evening or day wherever you are. And again, to thank you very, very much for taking part.